Hello, this is Joe Yuhan here today to talk about the importance of hip flexion. Hip flexion in the running stride is the action or the musculature that takes our leg from that push-off position and flexes or lifts it upward and forward for propulsion. That is like the front half of our stride. If the front half is flexion of the hip, the back side is hip extension. Over the years, I've talked about a lot of different components of running mechanics, and we've talked quite a bit about the importance of hip extension and push-off. We've talked about the importance of how the foot lands and paws back or pulls or pushes towards push-off. And in general, we've talked about those aspects of efficiency in how we land. But we really haven't talked extensively the importance of having strong, efficient hip flexion, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Because strong, efficient hip flexion does three things for our stride. Number one, it improves landing efficiency. Number two, like we just talked about, hip flexion is the reciprocal or the opposite of hip extension. And so the better we drive up with one leg, the more power that goes in the extension of the other. But the third one is the most interesting one to me that probably gets the least amount of attention. That efficient, strong, and full hip flexion sets the hip ball and socket to have a strong and glute activated extension. And so we'll talk about that component. But let's just go through the first two. So the first one, and the one that's been most evident for me as a runner and as a PT and as a running coach, is hip flexion and how it impacts landing efficiency. And so one of the most impactful elements of running injury is overstriding. And so overstriding occurs when any part of the foot lands significantly in front of the body. What happens in that case is a braking force is created. My foot's here, my body's back here. When I land, there's the braking force that then is absorbed not only by the leg, but the rest of the body. What we want instead is when that leg comes through, we flex it efficiently and powerfully up so that it lands straight down. A foot that lands straight down, less energy is wasted and absorbed, more energy goes towards pushing off. So hip flexion is really an efficiency there is self-evident. A compact uplift means a compact down landing. Super important. The other thing that is fairly well known is that reciprocality. The stronger I lift my left hip, for example, the more power is then transferred into the right hip extending. That is a Newton's law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so, even if you're really strong with your hips, in your glutes into extension, if you're not lifting the opposite side, you're losing out on power. And so, there are two examples then of how we can use our glutes or our hips and have good extension, but if we're not lifting, we're going to have problems. If we don't lift and instead I extend and then land like that, overstriding. If I extend but I don't lift here, I'm just not going to get as strong of an extension as if I go here first. So we've got avoidance of overstriding or improved landing efficiency. Then we have improved reciprocality of hip flexion on one side, accentuating and increasing the power of hip extension on the other. So now we're into the third one, and this gets a little bit more nuanced in how the ball of the hip moves in the socket. Because the third one is a strong and efficient hip flexion sets up the ball and socket so that the glutes can powerfully then take that leg and push it back. And for that to make sense, we have to kind of zoom in here and talk about what the ball and socket joint of the hip looks like. And so we have the pelvis here, and so if the pelvis is this sort of triangle-shaped bone here, and then we have a socket right there. And then the ball of the femur sits there. So if I take this and now I put it here. Here we've got, this is called the acetabulum, or the socket of the hip, and then the ball is here. So let's say this is my right leg and I'm just standing. I'm here. I need to be able to get that, and I should really kind of be here to allow that motion. That's extension, that's flexion. But if you really watch, so I'm going to really kind of bring this in to zoom in. If you watch what happens, if I want to keep this ball centered in this socket, let's say I'm down here, I want you to watch my knuckles right here as we go up. To keep it centered, watch what the knuckles have to do. Can you tell there's a downward spinning? That downward spinning is really important. It's called an arthrokinematic motion. The big movement is, here's the femur going up into flexion. But now watch the difference if we don't have that spinning down of the knuckles. I do that. So it almost spins off axis and it kind of bangs into the top of the acetabulum. Interestingly, this is a main source of hip pain for a lot of runners. This is hip impingement. Something called a labral tear inside the hip joint can occur if we don't have an efficient downward spinning of this hip. So that's another example of, okay, efficient hip flexion is important. Let's avoid this pinching. Let's avoid a labral stress. But the other important thing is if I go here and say I don't efficiently and powerfully get this hip way up here, then let's say I'm only lifting, let's zoom back up and let's talk about this in real terms. Say I'm sort of a shuffler in my running and I'm only kind of doing this. What that means is you can see I'm not lifting very much. Or maybe I might have really good hip extension, but I don't ever lift my hips, as opposed to someone who runs like this. If we fail to adequately hip flex, coming back to this, we don't get that ball sitting really nicely in the hip, centered in that socket. And so instead, if we don't ever get it up there, what tends to happen is the body is like, well, Joe's not using his hip flexors very well. We got to get this leg to lift up somehow. So it starts kind of doing this. So instead of lifting up with the ball going down, just the whole leg comes up. If the whole leg comes up, it's really hard for the glutes to sort of grab that ball and then extend it. Conversely, if I do a really good job, that ball is now in the socket down here. Now these glutes can come and really powerfully extend that back. That's another really important factor. Yes, it's nuanced and it has to do with like these little movements of the hip. But for a lot of runners who really struggle with their ability to like activate the glutes, it's very often an efficiency issue of this ball in the socket. And that's why it's so darn important. It's almost like you can think of like cocking a gun or even cocking the bow, pulling the bow back on a bow and arrow. To get a powerful forward shot, you've got to pull it back. And it's the same thing here. If we want to have powerful glutes to push off, to run far, to run fast, and to run powerfully uphill, we've got to cock it. And how we cock it, that ball of the hip, is through hip flexion. And you can almost see this if I do this really well. If I lift my leg, I want to see like a little extra rounding happening here. If I do that, that's kind of cheating. I'm just taking the hip and I'm jamming it up. I want, again, femur bone to go up, but the ball to go down. That sits it in the socket, so it's cocked and ready to go, so these glutes can come back down here and pop that down. That's the third component. Powerful and efficient hip flexion sets up the glutes to be able to powerfully extend. So now we talked about that, how do we do that? There's two ways that we do that effectively. If we assume that everything is moving nice and we're not fighting against any stiffness in our hip. To strengthen this, we're going to do two important things. Number one, when we do hip flexion things, and we want those hip flexion things to be running specific, we want to do it with a neutral low back. It's really easy to sort of cheat flexion and do this. So I could do a variety of different strengthening things, which we'll talk about in the next video, and I can cheat my hip flexion by doing that. But really, I'm just flexing everything. And it's not going to force efficient ball and socket movement if I'm cheating like this. So being neutral forces that movement to happen efficiently at the ball and socket, and to a lesser degree a little bit at the pelvis, which brings in the other important factor. If we're going to work on efficient flexion of the hip, we want stability in the plane, in the frontal plane of the pelvis as well. And so if I go right away into, say, doing this, it's the same thing. I'm just flexing with my entire spine and pelvis. Instead, stable, flexing up. This stays stable. And so again, where does the ball go? If I keep it stable here and stable here, the ball has no choice. But when I flex it up, it's going to go down, seated efficiently in the socket. So those are the three important things and why hip flexion is super important. Landing efficiency, it adds power to hip extension, but the biggest thing is hip flexion is cocking that bowstring. It puts the hip ball in the socket, so then we can have the very best, most powerful, and most efficient hip extension in our stride.